Hi, everyone. In this review, I'm going to run over the main points in Chapter 6, which is about corporate strategy, corporate level strategy. I'll be talking about this chapter in class as well, but because we're running late in the course, I'm going to do my best to make those comments in class a little briefer than normal. We'll see how that goes because it's difficult to abbreviate comments on these chapters since there is so much in them. But the purpose of this video is to give myself and you a little more time in looking at these slides and talking about the concepts behind them, just for your own benefit. So with that, let me see if I can bring up the PowerPoints for this chapter. And there they are. So with that, I think I'll just get going. The chapter covers these subjects. The notice of a corporate profile. We don't see that term very much in strategic management, but it's a good enough way to summarize things in an overview. Then Parnell talks about corporate strategies. In Chapter 7, he'll get into strategies for individual businesses. This is all about strategy for the entire corporation. Then we'll talk a bit about how to go about pursuing corporate growth, and then the possibility of not pursuing growth, but rather simply to maintain a stable position. And then one of several strategic management graphic devices, which which I'm also providing to you in my lectures. This one is the BCG matrix, which is certainly a good one to get started with because it's widely used throughout strategic management. So here we go. Some of these slides, of course, don't require a whole lot of explanation. This is one. We're talking about corporate level strategies, and they're for the entire corporation. Parnell reminds us that we can also form strategies for individual business units, so-called competitive strategies, and functional strategies, such as strategy for technology and so forth, marketing and the like. So here's this first notion of the corporate profile. And Parnell makes an interesting point, and that is that at the very broadest level, you can characterize corporate structures three ways. Management chooses to compete in just a single industry, or it can compete in multiple industries that have things in common. And if they have things in common, such as the way the product is manufactured, or research and development, or the markets that are served, and the marketing and distribution channels through which they're served, then it's possible to seek synergy. That is, for combinations of business units to enhance one another, and they'll be better off, perhaps more efficient or more effective, as Parnell says here, as part of a whole than they would be individually. And finally, it's possible to compete in unrelated industries to form what's called a conglomerate. And by doing that, to hopefully avoid being so dependent on one industry that when a downturn occurs in that particular industry, that's devastating to the corporation because it doesn't have anything else to fall back on. Better, perhaps, to be engaged in multiple industries so that when one industry that you've made investments in turns down, perhaps other industries, or at least one that you've invested in, will turn up. This was very popular back in the 80s and the 90s, 1980s and 90s. I was involved back then, and there were lots of diversification strategies with this intent. I can tell you that most of the corporations, sometimes great big ones like Gulf and Western and several corporations were formed with this objective, and it turned out badly for those corporations. Today we see General Electric, a conglomerate. We've talked about this in class, and General Electric has done badly because it's just so difficult to acquire expertise and to concentrate enough capital in several industries separately to do any one of them justice. So most corporations that follow this third strategy haven't turned out too well. Some in the second strategy, such as 3M, which does research and development to support several small businesses, none of which could afford the research and development laboratories in plastics and other products that are common to all those businesses that 3M can conduct at the corporate level. So 3M operates corporate level laboratories that support the individual businesses. And finally, the first one, competing in a single industry, is what tends to produce the best results. Now, I must take a break in this presentation because I have been joined by my consultant who guides me in these things, and he's asked to have a word with me. You can see him here now. Hi, Waffles, come here. His name is Waffles. Hey, come here. And he is a Labradoodle, which is a cross between a golden retriever. I'm sorry, I said Labradoodle. He's a golden doodle, a golden retriever, and a standard poodle. But every time I do one of these videos, he comes in here and raises hell with me until I give him a cookie. Then he just turns around and walks away. But he knows he's got me right now. There's nothing I can do about it. So I'm going to minimize this slide. And I'm going to pause. I'll be right back. Okay, so we're back. Waffles, did I tell you my dog's name is Waffles? And Waffles has had his cookie, and so now I can continue on with the slideshow. Hold on just a second, and I'll bring it back. Okay, so we've talked about the three possibilities, the three broad possibilities of the way a corporation will be formed. And depending on the possibility that's chosen, that'll determine more specific elements of strategy. Now, we've talked about corporate profile, or the overall corporate structure. Now we're going to talk about three broad approaches to strategy. Shall we choose to grow, and that usually that's what we do, or shall we choose to remain the same as we are, at least in terms of size? That's pretty difficult. To be honest with you, I've helped a lot of companies in my career do their strategic planning, and I've never seen one plan to remain the same in size. And that's because costs continue to go up over time. So if your revenues don't go up, then profit margins get narrower and narrower. And finally, retrenchment to get smaller. And that certainly is something that corporations have to do sometimes, even though they may not want to. General Electric today is such an illustration. So is General Motors, and so is Ford. Each of those companies has decided to participate in fewer markets than they did several years ago. Growth strategies. You can see that we've got 4 possibilities on the slide. You can also see that on this slide, I've put these little brackets, these square brackets, and those are comments that I've added to Professor Parnell's slides, or to the publisher's slides, depending on who prepared them. Sometimes these comments aren't exactly right, or they need some elaboration, in which case I've added a comment just to finish them off. So the first strategy is usually called organic growth. That's the term that's normally used in my profession. And it's what John calls internal growth. The purpose is simply, or the approach is simply to increase the sales and the capital investment in products and operations that the company has now. And probably we could say product lines or product categories, because internal growth would not compel a company that makes a line of furniture not to make other kinds of furniture, for instance. And by the same token, a company that makes computers or something of that, something in high tech that would forbid it from making laptop computers as opposed to mainframes and storage devices and so forth. So really depend. You've got to be sure that you understand what the limits of internal growth are, as opposed to external growth, where we're acquiring other companies, and we'll get into it later. But external growth itself can take us further into our own category of products or services, or take us far afield. But in any event, we're acquiring other companies to do that. Another possibility is to merge. And really, it's just another form of external growth. And that's why sometimes I have a little difficulty with Parnell's words here. A merger occurs when 2 or more firms, he says usually of roughly similar sizes. We'll take that one with a grain of salt. Usually, frankly, one larger corporation is able to attract a smaller corporation because it can convince the smaller corporation, first of all, that its shareholders will benefit, but that company with the combined assets, with its assets combined with larger assets, can accomplish even more than it could on its own. But in any event, they become one company, and the ownership then of the combined corporation is shared pro rata by the prior owners of the individual companies. And finally, an acquisition. It is not a form of merger. This is a mistake. It's just not that. An acquisition is a separate means of growth all by itself, and it's as John mentions, one firm purchases another. It doesn't necessarily have to purchase the other firm in its entirety. For instance, it could purchase a division of a large corporation, and I've done transactions like that. I've done many acquisitions for my clients and some mergers. So an acquisition simply takes place when a buyer, and it can even be an investment company that is another firm, but basically it's just money looking to be invested. An investment firm or private owners may buy the division of a large corporation, or they may in fact buy a small company. But when they do, I guess those buyers form a firm or may form a firm which purchases the other firm. But you want to take the language in this bullet just a little with a little grain of salt. And John says often with a combination of cash and stock, and it really depends. Acquisitions are most often done these days with cash. That's just the nature of the beast. Okay. External growth can usually occur more quickly than internal growth. That certainly is true. If management feels a need to be involved in a particular market or industry segment, because it sees a void in its current portfolio of businesses, which make it less viable and less attractive to owners of stock. It may find it compelling to get into another industry, and the fastest way to do that, of course, is to buy another company that's already in the industry. I might add that when the industry is mature, when new companies are not coming into the industry, and it's very unlikely to start a new corporation in that industry to enter the industry as it's growing. And about the only way to enter the industry is through an acquisition. But as Parnell points out, integrating newly acquired firms into another company is difficult. So I can tell you on a number of occasions when I've assisted clients in buying other companies, the big challenge, first of all, as we were trying to decide whether to buy that company, we asked ourselves whether the two cultures could come together. But that's a very difficult judgment to make when you don't own the company. And on occasion, I have certainly seen companies wish that they, how could I say it? I was going to say wish they hadn't bought the company. I don't think that was true, but I do think that they wished that they had done more preparation for clashes between personalities of executives that occurred, as well as workforce, marketing people. If they have different attitudes about how to deal with customers, if you got two marketing organizations with different attitudes, you can just imagine what kind of problems could arise. Having done an acquisition or a merger, it certainly is likely that the corporate profile, that is the structure of the enterprise, is going to change substantially. You're going to have a different kind of company. However, Parnell points out now that growth isn't necessarily the best strategic alternative. And he now moves into 5 growth alternatives. So horizontal integration is simply the acquisition or merger of another company in the same industry. And as I say, when industries get mature, this is about the only way that companies, if they're going to stay in the same industry, are going to grow, is to merge or acquire with another one. But having done so, the greater size of the company enables it to get scale economy, and in some ways benefit by having greater purchasing power, and maybe even greater marketing power, so that customers and suppliers have to take the resulting corporation much more seriously. Horizontal related diversification is to expand into an industry that is not the same as your industry, but there are a lot of similarities. When Deere, the manufacturer of agricultural equipment, acquired companies and developed its own products for construction, to make construction products, that was horizontal diversification. When Deere acquired Timberland, a manufacturer of logging equipment, that was horizontal diversification. Why horizontal? Because all of those product categories use diesel engines and tracks. Deere does make some wheeled vehicles too, but many of its products, the majority, are tracked rather than wheeled vehicles. In this case, there are so many things in common that lots of synergies can occur by taking advantage of each other's core competences. And so these are horizontal, that one, Deere has done horizontal related diversification. Conglomerate diversification is what I was talking about earlier. This is where a corporation intentionally gets involved in multiple industries, and the purpose of that diversification is to avoid the risk of being overly dependent on any single industry, which may be highly sensitive to fluctuations in economic cycles. So to the extent, especially as I mentioned earlier, back in the 1980s and 90s, corporations wanted to be engaged in industries with different economic or business cycles. And so when one industry was on the increase, it was okay if another one was decreasing, and vice versa. The problem is that when recessions occur, most industries don't increase. and most of them decrease. And so, although the risk of management objective here was certainly understandable, it was hard to accomplish. And diversification generally has not been a very successful strategy. Vertical integration refers to the value chain and moving upwards and downwards in the value chain. So let's consider Firestone or Goodyear. Both of those companies make tires and they sell those tires to auto manufacturers. However, to make the tire requires lots of chemicals and rubber. And so Goodyear and Firestone both own their own rubber plantations. And Goodyear has substantial chemical operations too. So Goodyear does not have to be as dependent on its chemical suppliers as it would if it couldn't supply itself when the automotive market is expanding. There's great demand for chemicals and rubber. Goodyear can certainly deal with chemical suppliers, but if the chemical supplier gets greedy or can't deliver as much or in a timely manner as Goodyear prefers, then it can take care of its own needs. Similarly, there comes a time, I shouldn't say similarly, on the other hand, there will come a time when the auto market declines, especially during recessions. We've all seen that. Now, at that point, Goodyear and Firestone have a problem, and that is that they would like to keep their most talented workforce working in their plants, their manufacturing facilities, rather than lay those people off, fire them. Because when business gets good again, they'll have to go out and re-recruit those people, and those people may no longer be available. That's a real problem. So it would be great if you could still sell tires even when the automotive market declines. And Goodyear and Firestone have solved that problem by opening their own chains of thousands of retail tire stores. And so as you drive down the street, it won't be very long if you're in a town or a city before you see a Goodyear tire store or a Firestone tire store. Now, those tire stores may do things other than sell tires. They may repair cars and service them and so forth, but they sell tires. And because they sell tires, when the automotive market has declined and people aren't buying new cars, chances are their tires will get thin and they'll have to buy new tires. And the profit that Goodyear and Firestone enjoy from sales of replacement tires in their own stores is a lot higher than they can get when they sell thousands of tires to Goodyear, to Ford and General Motors and so forth. Ford and General Motors can drive a tough bargain. You and I can't. We just have to go into the Goodyear store or the Firestone store and buy the tire, and they'll put it on the car for us. But the profit on that tire is going to be, and the price that you and I pay for it, it's going to be a whole lot higher than the price that General Motors and Ford pay for the very same tires. Strategic alliances, and Parnell says often called partnerships. Here again, he's sort of taken these terms a little loosely. Partnerships sometimes are very formal, structured arrangements. Alliances, not always the same. But two or more firms simply agree to work together, share the responsibilities as well as risks. So we have risk sharing and responsibility sharing and of course reward sharing, depending upon how in-depth the combination is and the terms of the deal. And then finally, a stability strategy. Not finally, there's one that comes after that. But Parnell suggests that there may come a time when a firm no longer wants to grow, but it wants to simply maintain the same size. The very last item on the list here is probably the most impressive, and that is that it may be that when a firm gets too large, it can attract the government's attention. Pardon me, I had to bathe my throat. It may attract government attention, and the government will sue the company because it violates antitrust laws in this country. And the antitrust laws aren't usually as severe in other countries, but other countries may impose limitations on corporate companies' growth and in other ways. So there may come a time when enough is enough. If that's the case, this stability strategy probably won't last very long, will it? Because if the company stays about the same size and its costs, everything from wages to the cost of its materials and its overhead, electric power, whatever, continue to rise, if the company's revenues don't rise at the same rate, the profit margins will fall. So a stability strategy probably is temporary, and it won't be long before some sort of related diversification becomes the new strategy. So in any event, other possibilities could be simply that the industry no longer is growing. Again, that would suggest related diversification, or costs with growth of growth don't exceed the benefits. I'm not sure that maybe we've got it backwards here. Maybe the benefits of growth don't exceed its costs. Growth may place greater strains on quality and customer service, because to grow, you've got to stretch your ability to provide after the sale service, warranty, training to your customers' personnel if the need be. That certainly can be a problem. But as I say, stability strategies are quite rare, and when they occur, they're usually followed by related diversification. Retrenchment can occur after an industry begins to decline. Parnell gives you a bunch of reasons here, but if an industry starts to decline, if it's reached its maximum growth in its life cycle and starts downward, then retrenchment may simply be a necessity. And so the firm intentionally scales back. It gets out of parts of the markets that it's serving that no longer are profitable. It may continue to make, it may continue some divisions or parts of the business that are still profitable. But retrenchment does mean getting smaller. So there's a corporate restructuring that takes place. That corporate restructuring could be to reconfigure the company and get back on the growth track again, or as the next slide demonstrates, something entirely different can occur. So I'm sorry, not the next slide, but the next slides. So the first one is a turnaround where the corporation becomes leaner, at least initially. And what you see here is a lot of words that suggest that the business is pared down. But what's happening in the auto industry is that there's a turnaround going on in some firms in order to get into a faster growth mode, to get into self-driving cars and electric cars, and sometimes to get out of markets that are not as rewarding as others. So General Motors has decided to withdraw from Europe and South America and to focus the majority of its growth efforts in Asia, particularly China. Ford, on the other hand, sees more opportunity in Europe because it's been there for a long time. In any event, a turnaround isn't necessarily an approach to getting smaller. Rather, it's an approach to getting different. Divestment is what I talked about earlier, and a unit of the business isn't performing well, and so a division or a subsidiary of a large corporation could be sold to another company that could make use of that business because it fits that corporation, that buyer's strategy. Maybe that the business that's sold off isn't growing too much anymore, if at all, but it generates good cash flow. It's just not a grower. And there are a lot of private companies that love to have corporations that generate good, rich, steady cash flow, even though they don't grow in sales or profit margins as much as they did in the past. So the business is spun off and both sides are happy. Liquidation is when you throw in the towel. As John says, this is the strategy of last resort, and all the assets are sold. Proceeds from those sales are used to settle the firm's liabilities, and the company goes out of business. Okay, so at this point, Parnell gives you some suggestions in doing your project. And I hope that you are using these suggestions in the book as you go through them. Parnell gives you suggestions on steps that you should be taking to do your project, your project to study a company. And so here are 3 items that he suggests that you do in your project. Now we're going to talk about this Boston Consulting Group growth share matrix. It's a very popular graphic device to illustrate and portray the strategy of a company. And we've been talking about corporate growth, and so one of the axes on this matrix refers to growth. You can see the y-axis refers to, at one end, low growth and the other high growth. Now, in fact, the way we normally do this is that there is, I don't know whether I can do this here or not, but let me try. If I can just bring a line down through here. And now well, I guess you can see that. But at the very top of the axis is very high, and down at the bottom is no growth or even decline. But this is a scale, isn't it? It's not a high or low. It's a scale. And what we do is place, and by the way, your market share is relatively high or relatively low. So this is also a scale, right? From really, notice that the scale is reversed. This is over on the right is really low market share, and over on the left is really high market share. This simply enables the graphics to be done a little neater, but you need to be aware of this. Now, what we'll often do then is we'll portray the company's various businesses in as, whoops, see if I, yeah, there we go. So I'm not sure what this mini case, let's see if I can get rid of that. I'm not sure. I'm just gonna get rid of all that. Hey, there we are. Okay, so and I'll make it a little smaller just so. All right, so this would be, and you can see that our market share in this case isn't terribly high, but it's not really low. It's relatively high. Now let's have another one here, and we'll put it on this page. And here's a cash cow. And maybe what we might have is 2 or 3. We don't have to have just one here. But in any event, here's a cash cow. We'd like to have very few dogs. These are companies who have low market shares, and they're not growing very fast either, and their industry isn't growing very fast. So we hope they're not very big. Now, what we're going to have also are some investments. Okay. So, and we'll probably have a half a dozen or so of these businesses, and ideally we're going to have more than one of these guys too, because these are good things to have. So let's talk about what we have here. Here is a company or a business that's large, okay, and it's not. I don't want to cover up cows, so I'll put this down here. But it's not growing very fast. So when it makes profit, that profit doesn't have to be reinvested in the business. Instead, that profit becomes free cash flow. And what we can do is, if I can get this right, we can send that cash up here, okay, to fund the growth of businesses that we're developing, new businesses. And so they're probably early in the industry or market life cycle, but they're early on. They're getting started, and we hope that one of those will eventually become a star, right? And go that way. However, most cash cows, sadly, most question marks sadly end up going this way. And that's because they're speculations, and it's really difficult to make a successful speculation. So we need plenty of cash in order to provide the funding for these investments. And instead of question marks, in my BCG matrix, I call these ventures because they are just that. The other thing, of course, that happens with the cash from the cash cow is that because stars are still growing, they may need a little cash, extra cash too. So, but because they're growing and because they have a high market share as well, research demonstrates that they probably also have high profit margins. So this is great. We've got stars that are generating profit. We've got ventures or question marks that offer us the prospect of more profit in the future. We don't have too many dogs, and we've got a nice cash cow that is providing free cash flow so that we don't have to go to the bank as much to fund the growth of our stars and ventures. Although in a corporation that requires lots of assets, we still may have to do that. Now, one of the things that we haven't mentioned is the fact that eventually stars will become cash cows. Over time, they will quit growing so fast. They'll keep their market share if they're run well, but eventually they'll become cash cows. I'm trying to find a place where this will work the best, but I guess maybe over here was fine. What we want in a BCG matrix is a graph that looks sort of like this, a well-balanced portfolio. Now, in my travels as a consultant, I often have found companies that just had cash cows. So the management was fat, dumb, and happy. You know, they had lots of free cash flow, might buy corporate aircraft, have nice, comfortable executive office suites, but limited growth potential and limited future. So they're not going to be comfortable for long. On the other hand, today we live in an environment where interest rates are really low. And so when companies borrow money and buy and make lots of ventures, that is, put lots of businesses in that question mark area, they may not have much in the way of cash cows, may have none, or at least small cash cows. They may have stars or not. But let's say that the company just has the businesses up here in the top row. They've got question marks and stars. No cash cows, no dogs. What would that tell you? The answer is it would tell you that this company is in the banks, that this company, in order to operate, has to use lots of borrowed money. Now, what's going to happen when the economy changes and interest rates go up? That particular company is going to starve to death. It's not going to be able to meet its obligations to banks, and so you know, a company, a larger corporation that has a better balanced portfolio with lots of free cash flow already will probably buy that company in an acquisition. And frankly, as an acquisition advisor, that's what I did. I would go out looking for companies that had unbalanced portfolios and try to put the right kind of businesses in place so that their portfolios were better balanced. When you have a nice balanced portfolio like this, life can be very good. Okay, so Parnell gives you some suggestions about options for strategic managers. Build market share with stars and question marks. Hold your market share with cash cows. milk as much short-term cash as possible, or divest a dog. In all honesty, I don't think after I explain this to you, you benefit a whole lot from that slide. Okay, now Parnell moves into another category of corporate strategy, and I'm glad that he put this in here because it's very very helpful these days, since we find ourselves more and more in global industries and global markets. You know, it's very difficult to be engaged in a substantial industry and not be doing business in multiple countries. So Parnell says that you can think about this at three levels: being engaged very minimally in international markets, and be in multiple countries, and then finally global, where you're in several interrelated businesses. So involvement at that first minimal level, a company involves in importing goods from, and perhaps services from companies in other nations, exporting its products to them so that it can make full use of its existing capacity. It can do licensing. It can authorize companies in other countries to use its processes. It can do franchising. If a company does franchising domestically, such as Holiday Inn, or gosh, I'm trying to think of one that one of our teams is using, and I can't right now. But very often, you may know that I was director of corporate planning at Holiday Inn many years ago. And so after Holiday Inn did quite well domestically, the question really became, what do you do now? How do you continue to grow? And the answer, of course, was to extend the franchising system to other countries. And that's exactly what Holiday Inn did. And then, of course, strategic alliances, which are cooperative arrangements to do outsourcing and essentially to participate jointly in the manufacturing or servicing or distribution of each other's products. So that's the first level. Now, in addition to those items, a company can decide that international markets are attractive, things are going pretty well in them, and so it invests in its own manufacturing in another country, and then another, and eventually probably forms a subsidiary or two or three or four or five in those other countries where it has manufacturing operations, because those other countries have laws regarding corporations, and it's usually advantageous to form a corporation under the corporate laws of each country individually. So the company makes direct investments in those countries and forms subsidiaries. And those subsidiaries respond to each country's markets as required to maximize market share and to be most acceptable to the culture as well as the government. At the third level, we have something which, aside from calling it involvement at the global level, a very common term in my profession is transnational. A transnational strategy involves just what is stated here: investments in businesses abroad. However, those businesses are interrelated. So when you learn how to make a product or a component for a product in one country, and you learn how to do that very well, you can take that knowledge, if it improves upon methods in other divisions around the world, and take that knowledge to those other divisions. And so companies can benefit from each other within a global framework. This requires lots of coordination. It is much easier to say than to do. There may be lots of fluidity required in the organization, transferring of people between divisions in different countries, and lots of communication between division level management and corporate level management, because corporate level management has to discover where these new discoveries are being made, perhaps where materials have become more affordable or less affordable, and then discover ways to obtain the materials that had been purchased in one country to obtain them in another country, so that the division faced with higher material costs can keep its cost under control and still make a good profit. It's a much more complicated form of business, isn't it? But it also is an indication of the direction of things today. Large corporations are becoming transnational in nature. So the Parnell gives you some thoughts about how to decide which of those three growth options is most appropriate. The first question he asks is, are customer needs abroad the same as those that you're dealing with right now? If so, then it's easy to export your product and eventually to expand with investment in manufacturing capabilities. Sometimes this happens in the automotive industry. Among others, semiconductors are the same no matter where they are produced. They're all used pretty much the same way. And so since the customer needs are the same for transistors and semiconductors rather, then it really becomes a question of where you're going to locate your operations, and you're going to do that so your distribution costs to the customer are lowest, but most importantly, your manufacturing costs are lowest. The second question, are differences in transportation and other costs conducive to good operations? And sometimes this is a real problem. India is known to have some less than ideal roadways. And if a country doesn't have good paved highways, then it becomes real difficult to transport intricate machinery on a truck, by way of example. You may have to use railroad, or you may have to get that machinery to your customer by air. Or you may just decide that because it's not possible to transport your product, maybe it's a perishable product, that you simply won't enter that country. Are the firm's customers or partners already involved in global business? Because if they are, they'll be easier for you to work with if you're global. I might add that this is a big consideration in the auto industry. One of the things that I confronted with one of my clients in Detroit is that it was making products for customers in the automotive industry. And to build another plant to make the products that this company made is a real capital requirement. And this company would have preferred not to build another plant. But its customer, General Motors, decided to build another factory to assemble cars in, I forget where it was, Malaysia or something like that, but it was in the Southeast Asia. And so even though they didn't want to do it, my client had to go off behind General Motors and put a plant in Malaysia. Why? Because if it hadn't, another manufacturer of those same components would have done so. General Motors might have liked doing business with them so much that it would start buying its components for operations in the United States and other countries from that competitor as well. So if your customers are multinational or international and prone to growing into other countries, then you've got to be prepared to do the same thing. Will it be difficult to distribute? Of course, we were just talking about India's roadways. What about a product that has to be refrigerated, a food product? Supermarkets and food distribution companies in countries, again, like India, are not as well set up and not as well endowed with refrigeration plants and freezers and the like as in this country. So that would be a big problem, wouldn't it? Therefore, you have to figure out how to produce products that don't have to be distributed, refrigerated. And sometimes that creates whole new product categories. For instance, instead of producing a product that is kept frozen, some products can be freeze dried and sold in a real hard sort of a cube that's vacuum packed. And when the customer gets it home, opens the pack and then takes the powder out and mixes it with water and heats it, and you get the same product that you used to have to keep refrigerated. So, but you've got to take all that into consideration before you expand. Will government trade policy facilitate expansion? And of course, we always think of our own government here in the United States, but if you're a corporation headquartered elsewhere, such as China, then you've got to think about what China or the UK or France or Germany or wherever your headquarters may be. In addition, you've got to take into account what the government in a country that you'd like to expand into is going to do when you seek to expand there. By way of example, the government of India for a long time, and still to some extent, does not want corporations in that country to be majority owned by foreigners. So PepsiCo, for example, moved into India by acquiring a minority interest in a large soft drink manufacturer. And then when the law changed, it bought out, some years later, it bought out the remaining interest. And of course, the owners of the company that had acquired a minority interest and then majority from were very happy to do that because they got a lot of US dollars. And finally, can managers in one country learn from managers in other countries? And that's what you're looking for when you're talking about transnational strategy to growth. And that and by the way, one of the things that the better managed multinational corporations do is to develop training methods to enable managers in one country to learn from managers in other countries through all sorts of devices, not just training, but also temporary assignments, rotation of managers between divisions and so forth. Very, very important. So there you go. That's chapter 6. We did, and as I promised at the beginning of this video, there's no way we could have done this review in the depth or in the detail that we would have had time for in a regular class session. So I hope this video helps you. Sadly, not all members of the class will look at the video, but for those of you who do, I think you'll be a lot better prepared both to do your work on the project, to pass the quizzes and the tests, but to have a better prospective career when you enter corporate management. This stuff is so important that I can only hope that most of you do take the time to look at this video. And I hope that you feel that it's been beneficial. So with that, I'm going to stop this video and hope, as I say, that you have benefited from it. I'll see you in class. Bye.